So I'm going to assume that you are
Alison Warner.
Alison. All right. So Alison Warner is next to me. She's MD of Blue Zoo Rights. It's a leading animation studio, if you don't know that. Liz Bryan is next to her. Hello, Liz. She's from Grant Thornton. She's head of media tax. And of course, in the end, we've already heard from Hugh Walters. He's director of industry media, which is a consultancy. So this section is supposed to be on the future of finance, sort of the next bit. So we've heard sort of where we are, where we think we are, as much as we can figure out where we are in terms of the Brexit scenarios, deal, no deal, whatever. What we really want to do in this one is talk a little bit more about co-production deals, treaty-based co-production, how can these grow, implications for tax incentives, all those kind of things. And I think one of the things that was very good in the last session is we did hear about the cultural test, so I think that's helpful. So Liz, if I can start with you.
Sure.
How will Brexit impact our ability to work with cultural partners in the EU? Now, obviously it depends what kind of Brexit we're talking about here, but give us sort of your view in terms from the kind of the tax world on how this is all going to work.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there's actually good news, and in the wider piece about working with Europe, it might be something we can come back to at the end of this session, because I think people are going to talk about their experiences. Maybe I can cover two things. I'm actually standing here a bit for Anna from the BFI as well today, so I get to cover the cultural test question and tax credit. So can I deal with those
yes,
together
please.
if I
Let's
get
do
them?
that. Yep.
So Robert stole my thunder, but I guess most of you in the room know about the cultural test and the significance of it, in as much as you need to satisfy the cultural test in order to claim UK tax relief in respect of a qualifying animation programme or film. So audience participation, for those of us that are in the room, is everyone pretty comfortable with the cultural test and what it actually covers and how it's made up? Yep, is that mostly? No? Okay. Right, for anyone that doesn't know, the cultural test is an assessment of a programme or a film, a piece of content that covers 4 different areas that cover the cultural contribution of the programme, the content, where it's being made and the people working on that programme, to assess, and I'm going to put it, this isn't a real word, to assess its Britishness in order to qualify for the UK tax credit. Now, because we're part of Europe and part of the EU, that cultural test does make reference to the EU in terms of working out qualification, and particularly the people working on a programme or film and the extent to which they qualify. So, as Robert said earlier, there are changes that have already been put in place in the cultural test, and you might say, why are they needed? So the reason that they're needed is to avoid what would otherwise be a really bizarre situation. So I'm going to give you an example from the animation cultural test. If you look at the section which covers essentially who are the people working on the project and the points that you can gain from that, if you read the wording from that, and we'll take, let's say, lead actors, voiceovers, director, producer, what it actually says is that you get points depending on whether the relevant person is an EEA citizen, which is great, or resident. The problem comes that if there is a no-deal Brexit, at that point, we all cease to be EEA citizens, which would mean, bizarrely, you could have a project that was wholly staffed from the UK, and if you had to claim points for UK people involved in that project, you wouldn't be able to claim points for them because we're not EEA residents. So people in the UK wouldn't be able to satisfy the test. So you'd have an anomalous situation where really that probably the project was as British as you could get, but actually you wouldn't be able to score the points because you wouldn't be residents. So there is already a change that was legislated earlier this year in February in order to tweak that so that it says UK or EEA. Right. And that's obviously very necessary because we'd have, I say, a very odd situation. So that's great in terms of the cultural test.
Yeah, and that's what Robert was referring to. We're safe now on the cultural test.
That's the detail on it, on why it was needed and what difference it makes.
Yeah.
The next bit is the UK tax credit. So a lot of Brexit is doom and gloom, but this is good news story in terms of the tax credit. So as most people know, the UK tax credit is enshrined in UK tax legislation. And there isn't going to be a change of that. Government, as you've heard earlier, are committed to continuing to support the creative industries. So I'm not aware of any proposed change to that legislation. The legislation itself does constitute EU state aid, which is obviously a way of monitoring amongst all the EU countries the level of support that's being given by any country to its residents in terms of incentives and how that gets tested across the EU and how that gets reported. In terms of a deal, Brexit, there won't be a change to that. And should there be a no deal, my understanding is that state aid will then be administered by our Competition and Markets Authority. So essentially there won't be any difference to that, and state aid is a reporting requirement rather than something which will of itself impact the UK tax credit. So in terms of Brexit, whilst there are lots of other factors which could impact how you work with the EU, in terms of the tax credit itself, there should be no fundamental impact on your ability to claim the tax credit, and in fact positive changes have already been made to make sure that that stays the same.
That's good. That's great.
Sounds great.
I know that the UK government also signed this revised convention on the cinematographic co-production. So how does that help us, Liz? I mean, this gives flexibility to UK producers, right? What does it give? The kind of changes that we need, or the flexibility that we need?
So the European Convention actually is administered by something slightly different to the EU, but again, there are tweaks that are being made there to enable UK producers to work within that framework. So again, it's a positive message that whilst there may be changes that will be required depending on whether we have deal or no deal, again, it's anticipated that we will be able to continue to work within that framework. And exactly the same situation exists with regards to any of the other bilateral co-production treaties that the UK have with any of the rest of the world countries as well.
Okay, so really that's not a problem at the moment.
It's not a fundamental problem. I think more
I like non-fundamental problems,
which we'll talk about later, is the practical ability to work with producers within Europe, whether it be financing or actually moving.
Which is actually a problem, because that maybe gets into something you might want to say, which is, how do you actually do that? In other words, are we in a situation now when you as a producer kind of look around for partners and, people say, well, we don't know what you're going to be next week. You may not be part of the EU, you may not be part of, we don't know.
I think that is happening, but having said that, I think it's only an element. I think if you're a producer that's looking inwards towards the UK, it's not just about finance. I know that that's what we're talking about, but obviously it is about, the talent, how you actually put the co-production together in terms of what can that producer do that will complement the skill set of the other production company. So certainly, they're still very much on the table.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that you're getting kind of people don't want to work with you right now because they don't know what the future is? I mean,
it's interesting, actually.
Probably mostly French producers, probably. No, sorry.
I'm sort of not quite getting that. And I'd like to think that, I'm here to talk about an optimistic view of what's going to happen, because we still don't know what is going to happen. That's true. But what I do know is that producers out of Europe, out of Canada, Australia still reckon that the UK is a creative hub. They want to come to us because of our writing, because of the fact that we animate brilliantly. We have fantastic broadcast platforms. We've got to think about how all that works as well. And so the desire for us all to work together is still there. I've latterly just come back from both the Cartoon Forum and MIPCOM, and obviously there's been a lot of talk. Yes. The presentations, there are a couple of mutterings of, well, no one's going to be able to co-produce for the UK with this particular show. But I think there is an ability to be creative. I was talking with a producer just yesterday saying, well, what are your thoughts? He's trying to get a feature film together with a German co-producer. And in order for the German co-producer to maximise their tax credits, they have to work within a EU country. And of course, because we don't know, they're actually getting creative, and they've set up an office in Dublin. So, that's a solution if you want to think about that.
Yeah, just be practical. So Liz, when you look at this, I mean, do you think the UK will be able to co-produce with the EU partners if there's a no-deal Brexit? I mean, what's going to be how complicated is it going to be?
Well, I think Robert alluded to that earlier. I think presumably the bodies have done as much as they possibly can to lay the groundwork now. I'm hopeful that there won't be a no deal, but were that to pass next week, there would still be work to be done in order to keep the UK within, let's say, the convention and actually allow producers still to be able to work within that. I think that's a lot harder in terms of actually making sure that does get put in place, although the ratification is there in terms of the change that was made in February of this year. That would need to be signed off and put in place. If there is a deal, obviously that changes everything, and you have a much smoother situation in terms of working going forward. And I'm sure it echoes everyone's view in terms of wishing for that and not avoiding the no deal scenario.
Yeah. Do you have on your desk? Do you have two sides, people know if no deal we do this, if deal we do that? I mean, it seems like it's hard for professionals who are looking at this to figure out how to advise clients. I mean, we're in this kind of no man's land.
Yeah, and some other sectors actually are impacted arguably far more than the creative industries, particularly those sectors that import and export to a large degree, and they've obviously had to put preparatory steps in place in the event of a no deal. However, there is still an impact, and I think it's just the continuing uncertainty. Somebody talked about it earlier on in terms of the uncertainty that provides. I think everyone would love to just have some clarity to be able to move forward, because I think there is probably little that you can do at this stage, short of, say, people setting up offices in Dublin, etc. That's quite an extreme move, unless you've got a good commercial rationale for needing to do that anyway. So they're probably short of that. Little that people can do until they're clear about what is actually happening.
So what's the wider implications of all this on Brexit, on the UK creative industries tax relief in general? I mean, we've sort of said that the cultural test has been changed, and so that's going to basically help with a lot of the tax relief stuff, that most of that stuff should just happen now. Yeah. But is there any wider implications on the cultural industries, creative industries, in terms of tax relief that we need to take into account? I don't know.
You're talking about non-Brexit?
Non-Brexit, yeah.
There's another, who knows what's going to happen. I guess there could be a change of government, and that probably poses, the next biggest question mark in terms of continuation of the tax reliefs that are available, to be honest. Successive governments, over the last 10 years have shown their commitment to the industry. Not just through the introduction of the release, but obviously into the messages that are coming out of DCMS, etc. So I'm ever hopeful that is now culminating in terms of, let's say, the CBI report and the evidence that's coming through in terms of the difference that this industry is making in terms of contribution to the UK GDP, etc. So if you look at that and you say, well, actually, it's a force for good, why should there be a change? Then hopefully that supports the continuing relief being available. I guess the flip side is that the relief was there to target need, is there to plug a gap. It's there because there was shown to be market failure, particularly, let's say, for animation sector, in terms of making sure that this country could retain animation production, and it needed a tax relief to do that. And in a way, sometimes being so successful in terms of the overall industry, that it perhaps begs the question, actually, is that relief still required? I'm sure everyone would say
Tell me you're not telling us to be less successful so we can make sure.
I'm not. And I think in terms of film, animation, television, that's certainly the case, and I think a lot of producers in the room and listening to this will be able to testify to the help that having the tax credit has made. Some people may have seen the article in the press within the last 2 weeks, though, about the video games tax relief, and it turns it on its head in terms of where that benefit has actually fallen and whether that's still required. I think there's a good case for this industry, particularly that it is still required.
Particularly for animation,
Yeah.
you mean? Okay. And probably children's content.
And children's as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we also have a drama tax relief.
We do.
And that's obviously, I think, the drama makers, given the cost of drama, it just keeps escalating. I think they're very happy to have that as well. I'm not sure how many drama producers there are here, but I know that, you know, when Netflix is pouring money into drama and hoovering up talent, it, you know, it makes your production more and more and more expensive. So you sort of need these if we're going to compete on the global stage, which is where we are now. I think that's the thing to keep in mind with all this. We're talking about Europe and the EU, but we're really competing now globally. A lot of the clients, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, probably Disney too, they're going to be basically commissioning for global platforms.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's going to be, I think it's going to be more competitive, to be honest. I don't think it's going to get less competitive.
Yeah, I agree. You know, it's interesting though to see that the likes of Netflix are now opening up in Amsterdam and centering that very much as a hub and looking actually for more European content to be coming out of that. It's not just US-centric. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, they're definitely going local. They all are.
I hope we're not going to get excluded as a result of that.
I agree. That would be a real shame. So Liz, I'm just looking at my other questions here. Some of them were, I'm not sure, you may have covered this. One question I was given was, is there double dipping on tax breaks if you're under a treaty with co-production? I mean, do you understand that question?
Yeah, can you say it again?
Is there double dipping on tax breaks if you're under a treaty with your co-production? In other words, is there a way to get, you know, to use the treaty to get tax relief in both places?
You could access tax relief in both places. Can you access tax relief on the same cost in both cases? I would say that most of the way that the tax reliefs have been designed in any jurisdiction is to focus on generating relief in a particular jurisdiction, and that's where you should seek to get the relief and obtain it. There are situations where certain of the treaties don't fit, they overlap slightly. But double dipping has other connotations I don't really want to go into.
No, maybe not.
And I'm sure nobody in this room would advocate, because it goes against the grain of what we're actually trying to achieve through the tax relief, which the primary aim of that was to keep production in the UK and incentivise costs incurred in the UK for production.
Okay. Now, Robert talked a little bit about state aid. What's your, I keep coming to you because obviously you're the tax person, but if you want to come in on that, please do, if you have something to add. But
I think state aid is a double-edged sword, potentially. I think a lot of UK funding initiatives have been hampered by state aid rules in the past. I can think of several examples where public authorities in the UK have been very keen to be, probably over keen to be compliant compared to more entrepreneurial attitudes in some European countries, particularly west of Great Britain.
West of Great Britain.
You know, it's part of the entrepreneurial culture that the public funding is there to generate wealth, and state aid rules can sometimes hamper that. But you know, even without those state aid restrictions within the EU, there is still World Trade Organization rules that you have to abide by, and although they're not as restrictive as EU state aid rules, they're still there. So you know, you can't suddenly create the Wild West just because you're not part of the EU. But I think obviously, you know, they're there to try and maintain an equal level playing field between countries, and I don't see much change in the UK government's attitude towards them. I think maintaining a level playing field will probably be part of the thinking moving forward.
Yeah. Liz, do you have anything to add to that, or is that you agree with that basically? You agree with that? Okay. Do you think there's more opportunities if there's a no deal? Do you think that it would make more, Liz, there are more opportunities for money, or, I mean, is it better if we have no deal rather than a deal?
My personal view is that the disruption caused by a no deal will probably far outweigh any benefits that might be there in terms of negotiating.
Because of this long,
that's a personal view.
This long area where we have to renegotiate everything. Yeah. Yeah.
But at least with a deal scenario, there is that inbuilt flexibility, and I think more importantly, it's almost the psychology of working with the other partners in the EU as opposed to the no deal scenario.
Okay. Hugh, unless you have something to add to this. State aid.
Although I'm quite intrigued to know if there was a no deal, how long do you think this disruption would take? Because I do hear things like it could be a 10-year scenario, which could impact.
Well, it could be. It's a number of levels. So we talked
10
earlier.
years.
We talked about Creative Europe, for example. So how long would that, if there was a no deal, and people that are currently applying and don't make 31st of October, how long would that take before that actually gets resolved? And
not 10 years.
not 10 years. But government will have a huge amount in terms of all of the challenge it's going to have to deal with in that scenario.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a priority, a pecking order of what gets dealt with first.
Yeah, they're going to deal with
the funding
food,
requirements,
medicine. It's going to, national security. I mean, audiovisual services will be down here somewhere. Hopefully we'll be.
We've saved the recession, apparently.
Yes.
But even things like renegotiating trade deals. I mean, we've heard any number of ranges in terms of how long any of those could take. So I think that expectations of rapid solutions in a no-deal scenario, are not realistic. So
Weeks.
So
years.
Years, I think.
Years.
There we go.
God. All right. Hugh, let's talk about the AVMS. That's the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, especially the country of origin principle and the impact on broadcasters with all this. Now, I think you have some slides. Can you talk us through a little bit?
Matt, I think it's the second slide. It's the next one.
Sorry, I think I did it in the wrong order. This one? Yep.
I mean, I'm not really going to talk about what challenges facing broadcasters, but as far as producers are concerned, the main implication is European works and the definition of European works, because European broadcasters are under an obligation to promote European works, and in most cases to broadcast 50% of their output as European originated works. There was some concern that UK companies could lose that the benefit of that definition by pulling out of the EU, but actually the third acronym that you see there, the ECTT, which has come up a couple of times this afternoon, very much makes it clear that even if UK production companies are not EU part of the EU, then the definition of European works will continue to apply. So again, coming back to what Liz was saying about the tax credit and associated issues, there appear to be very few risks to UK producers in either a no deal or a negotiated settlement.
And this is really good news, actually, in the sense that I mean, this AVMSD is an important thing to.
Well, I mean, the directive covers an awful lot of things. It covers things like standards of advertising, child protection, diversity, and this is just one element of it. But I think the fact that it's not going to change the status quo as far as the ECTT is concerned is clearly a positive thing for UK producers.
Okay. Does anyone want to comment on that as well? Liz? No?
Just to be clear on this, Hugh, this is more of a directive for broadcasters, so that our content can still be accepted.
Yes, but
it's about
there's two elements to it. There's the broadcaster's obligation, or European broadcaster's obligation, to promote European works. But the second element is the definition of what constitutes a European work.
Exactly.
So
and we're still in that.
We're still in that. Yeah.
We're still in that. And then your other slide, do you talk more about the treaties, right?
Yeah.
Here we go.
And again, the message is very similar to the other elements that we've discussed. These treaties are enshrined in UK law, so they're there regardless of whether the UK is an EU member or not, because they're part of a separate European convention. The final point I make, non-treaty co-production activity will continue to be significant. I think we can get too hung up on what treaties, conventions say. in practice, European co-production, treaty co-production is a very, very small part of overall global co-production activity. Most of our clients are generating business outside the UK from countries such as the US, Australia, Canada, without any formal co-production arrangements. They just follow the market rather than being bound by treaties. And there's also, I mean, Alison can probably vouch for this, that there are so many different ways of structuring a co-production these days. You know, the old-fashioned 50-50, 50% made here, 50% made there, doesn't appear a great deal anymore, partly because of the UK tax credit, I have to say, because that's given additional leverage to UK producers in order to keep the work in the UK. But, you know, typically you could get a co-production as a post-production deal, you know, where a UK producer will partner up with a Belgian facilities house. The Belgian facilities house will secure a local tax credit based on their spend, which is reinvested in the production. That's not treaty dependent. That's a byproduct of the spend that's being made in that country. And there are a lot more of those types of deals happening, and I suspect a lot more will be done in future.
I agree. And what I mentioned earlier on, it's really all about doing your homework and to make sure that you actually, when you're entering into a conversation with a potential co-producer, whether it's somebody from Australia or Canada or France or all these various countries that we can work with, it's making sure that there is a fit. And you wouldn't believe how many people commence a conversation and and they quite often have no idea about how they're going to make it work. It's more that there's an intention. And I think obviously if you're a producer and you're looking to find work that's coming into you, then you need to ask the questions. But obviously if you're looking to co-produce with, let's say, a Canadian producer, I mean, sometimes you get people that have a show that it's going to be a CGI show, and they go and talk to somebody that only produces in 2D and vice versa. And it's shocking sometimes the lack of homework that is done at the very beginning. So I think going back to what we need to do is actually make sure that there is more communication and that people recognise, who the production companies are in the UK and what their skill set is, and to make sure that we communicate that effectively.
It was funny when you said make sure there's a fit. I thought you would say, a cultural fit, skills fit. Basically, like, well, basically they don't do the right kind of animation.
Exactly.
I mean, come on, you can probably find this out on their website.
Yes.
If it doesn't work. Yeah. So I mean,
yeah,
I'm sure. So isn't this something that PAC's supposed to do? I mean, sort of give a clearinghouse for all the different producers that are part of the UK.
Yes, PAC do that.
Yeah.
Also,
but you think more work needs to be done, particularly now that we're facing possibly not being part of Europe?
I think there's. I think the communication, is opening up, and obviously things like the Children's Media Conference, that happens in Sheffield in July, and going to places like Kids Green, where again we are saying we're here, we're open, we're available for business. This is what we do, and this is how we can fit with what you guys do. And that is much more down to the creative process, the production process, the pipeline, and of course finance is a very integral part of it, but it's all those other elements that we need to think about as well.
So Hugh or Tony might have an idea of you on this. What about bilateral treaties with, and I've got a whole list of countries here, Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, China, India, Israel, Jamaica, Morocco, New Zealand, occupied Palestine territories, this is in my list, and South Africa. Will they be affected? Can you guys talk to that?
You largely covered that point earlier when he was talking about there's no need for formal co-production treaties in globally.
So those are the countries he's talking about.
With those countries, we've got those co-production treaties with. Some of the issues are, and this is me going out and doing some research on with PACT, with CMC, with BFI. We've got co-production treaty with Brazil. That took about 4 or 5 years to get through. The issues there, I met one of their politicians, MIP TV last year, I think it was, because at the moment there are issues in Brazil, which I think Jack might have more ideas on, but doing co-productions in Brazil, There are penalties for bringing money out of Brazil at the moment, which makes it pragmatically very difficult, going back to Alison's point about co-production. So it really does come back to what is the content and who are you going to be working with, whether it's in live action or animation, whatever it happens to be. And that research, you can't replace the value of the research that's done on that. So with Brazil, if somebody's going to Brazil at the moment, the chances are you're going to get co-productions away with Brazil if you're dealing with some aspect of it being in Brazil, or you know that you can't get a co-production where you're going to get value from the funding coming out, so you've got to get the value from keeping it in. And those little nuances are the key factors. And yes, I mean, we've got all these co-production treaties, and it'd be great to use as many as we can. I mean, China's a perfect situation. That treaty, the TV treaty, there was a film treaty BFI had completed before 2016, but in 2016 we finalised the wording of a treaty with China for the TV side of things. The Chinese government haven't yet still started to really promote that to their own companies, although they're now starting to happen. I had a conversation this morning with one of our very well-established animation companies and our consulate in China, because there's a potential co-production conversation going on there, and that was all about the pragmatism of will it work from the ground up and how the treaty can help facilitate that. And making that happen. So I think there are lots of opportunities with our co-production partners where there are treaties, but you've got to look at the local circumstance and what you can gain from all of those individual territories and what they've got to offer and bring to the table. Whether it's under the treaty or not, those basic principles I think are key, as Hugh said earlier.
Interesting. Do you have something to add to that? Or you? Nope. Yep, okay. Are there questions from the floor for this group? Genevieve, in the middle here. And is there another one? I can give a mic to somebody else. There's two mics. Not yet. Okay.
Can you? I think this is a question for Liz in place of Anna. Can you tell us a bit more about the Council of Europe Convention on Cinematographic Co-production? The pending treaty that is going to expand this list of co-producers.
So the Council of Europe Treaty, and it's going to expand the list of co-producers.
Yes, apparently it says on the BFI site, and perhaps we need to direct this to
Jack, whoever he is.
Did you talk about the February 2019
yes.
change?
Okay,
yes,
so February 2019 change. Is there going to be more?
I just wanted to know a little bit more about it.
Is there some place that Genevieve can,
Well, I think you probably
know more about this?
You probably looked on the BFI website, which is the main source, isn't it, in terms of the information. So I'm playing Anna here with this sort of question, and shame that she can't be here today because she'd answer that.
Yeah, I can take it with regard to the ECCC. So Anna, who was due to be here today but unfortunately is sick, her team, and particularly Chantal within it, looks at co-productions. I'm very much not the expert on the treaty, but I can definitely put you in touch with Chantal if you want to discuss it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions, informational or otherwise? Yeah. Not right now? Okay. Oh, you have one. Greg, sorry.
Just a very quick one. Greg, here again. Exchange rates is
exchange rates. Yep.
Something we're thinking about. I mean, I think it may come up in the next panel, but Neil and I were talking this morning about the fact that the current exchange rate is extremely advantageous to the UK in terms of attracting people to work with us, and I assume the panel all feel that will continue to be the case, because whatever happens with Brexit, our exchange rate is not going to be suddenly hiked.
True. Well, yes, but then it'll be a question of whether we can get those people in, right? Sorry. Yes, go ahead. You answer. You're the executive. You're the professional.
I think you're covering that. I think on 3 or 4, aren't you, in terms of employment? I think the people piece is the key piece. Is probably around, the ability to actually supply and obtain those people rather than purely the costing. Both from an economic perspective in terms of exchange rate, we'd love to say there shouldn't be significant changes. In a way, it's worked for and against the UK, hasn't it, of late, with, let's say, US-UK looking on the other side of the equation, and some of the impact that exchange rate has had around, contracting with the US. And so, it swings and roundabouts a bit depending on what you're working on and your current projects.
go ahead, you have a question.
So, okay, I just wanted to pick up on one point that you mentioned earlier, which I think is worth stating, and it's a bit of a plug in a funny sort of way for DIT, but you talked about the internationalism of the industry, and it be, you know, Netflix and all of those. Alison touched on that, having come from Technicolor and working in India and all those things. I think, you know, we are now in a much more global environment generally, and the point Alison made about the contacting of you know, between ourselves in the UK and other nations is crucial. Greg mentioned about CMC. One of the things we've tried to do in the last 3 years through DIT is to bring more and more of those international players to CMC in Sheffield and take more and more of our companies out to those other territories. 3 years ago, we started going to CMC, going to CCAF and IABC in Hangzhou in China. Yeah. Alison mentioned Kids Screen. There's been a deliberate effort to try and link those international, particularly in the kids and animation media side of things, jumping between all the events that you've mentioned, whether it's Cartoon Forum, Annecy, and trying to link so that the UK has got a thread running through that not only, as Alison said, we're open for business, but we're everywhere. And I think that's crucial. I think most of the people I've seen in the room today who I know already have that awareness and that attitude, and the kids industry has more and more over recent years worked on that basis of having, you know, we were talking about 50-50, I think you mentioned, or you know, somebody mentioned about 50-50 deals. You don't get 50% out of the BBC. You haven't got that for years. You used to years ago, but now you need 3 or 4 international partners to put together an international animation project. And I'm sure Alison will tell you from her background, that includes the licensing and merchandising, potential input at an early production stage, regardless of who's commissioning it. And I think the point you made on the international aspect of the business and getting out to make those contacts is crucial. And if, you know, regardless of whether we leave or stay in the UK, that's not going to change, and that should be a strong message.
That's true. It was interesting. You probably saw it because you were down at MIPCOM, but which is the big market, programming market in France. And the BBC studios had their new booth. Did you see their new booth?
I did. It looked very groovy.
It was very groovy. It looked like tin cans, you know, sort of the bottoms of cans put on. It was very silver, and it looked like a spaceship. It was wild. Anyway.
It looked like the Selfridges building in Birmingham.
There you go. That's what it looked like. And it was like 2 stories, and it was hot and cold running, whatever. But anyway, the point is that Tim Davie, who runs BBC Studios, has said publicly that, you know, they don't have the money to fully fund stuff anymore. That basically what he sees as his new mantra is being the best place for talent to work. In other words, how can we make an environment that talent wants to come and work with us? And so that's, you know, that's the way he's, quote, fixing this problem of not having as much money and having to compete with the big guys who have endless, you know, bottomless pockets because they're coming from Silicon Valley with incredible valuations. But there we go. So we're running out of time here. So I just want to say, is there any other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
Hello. Just you mentioned the animation tax relief earlier. So I just wanted to reiterate the importance of that for animation production. For us, some £6 million worth of production, all spent in the UK, wouldn't have been possible without that. And so that's just one key ingredient to our finance plans and getting anything made.
So as you wouldn't be able to do what you do without that animation production fund. Yeah. Well, that's something you definitely have to make sure that Robert knows, right? And also Jack. Jack, do you want to say something about that? Could you just give Jack the mic? Thank you.
Hi, sorry, it was just coded to the point I was making about ECC, sorry, because I just had to sit here and kind of thought a bit more about it. So with regard to the kind of the finer detail of it, absolutely, that's a question for Anna and her team. But just to say, the treaty as it is kind of signed through Council of Europe and is therefore unaffected by Brexit. The point was made that it has been signed but it hasn't been ratified yet. But just to say, I mean, the information that we get and from our discussions with DCMS, that's very much down to the fact that the amount of legislation there is to go through at the moment is very, very high, and there's kind of a lot of other things that are kind of taking precedence at the moment. It's not to do with wavering intention, it's just about when things go through. And so, the lines that we're getting are very much that, even in no deal, that the ECCC will go through, and that's what we'll be using, just to say.
Okay, so pretty sure that it will go through. I mean, obviously it's not through yet, but very high level of confidence that it will happen. And of course that means that we know pretty much that that's the kind of regime we'll be under, which is good. All right. Anything else from anybody? No? Okay. Well, this was really interesting, I think. I mean, we're supposed to have tea now, right? Yes. So we're going to come back at 4 for our next session. Please talk to these people in the break, and thank you all for coming. And please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you very much.